Hello, my name is Glenn Andreiev. I'm a filmmaker and film historian, and today we're going to be talking about those great science fiction films from the 1950s. You know, where there's lots of giant insects, men and women from other planets, giant dinosaurs running around wrecking things, so we're going to have a fun time. Now, I think science fiction really begins with the birth of cinema. You think about George Méliès's 1902 A Trip to the Moon. We've all seen clips of that. So in the 19-teens, there's a whole new craze about electricity. It's a novelty because not all homes in the United States had electricity. So it was a natural for filmmakers to make films like The Electric Boy, The Electric Dog, The Electric Policeman. So you saw a lot of that in the 19-teens. And then, of course, the most famous science fiction film out of the silent era is Fritz Lang's Metropolis. The film was made in 1926, and Lang was visioning what the year 2026, 6 years from now, would look like. And also there's The Lost World, which concludes with a brontosaurus rampaging through modern-day London via some terrific stop-motion effects by Willis O'Brien, who would later do King Kong. Now we get to Just Imagine. Oh boy, is this a wild movie. Made in 1930, it sort of predicts what New York City would look like in 1980, with flying cars, and instead of meals, we're fed pills, and we all have numbers instead of names. And since this film was made during Prohibition, there's a lot of wild drinking jokes and drinking songs. And towards the end of the film, 3 astronauts go to Mars, and they find out the people on Mars all love to drink, they all love to party, and they all have twins. So, it's a wild movie. See it. You have some science fiction type of films coming out of Hollywood in the 1930s, but they're more horror-based. We're talking about Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, Island of Lost Souls, Mad Love starring Peter Lorre. That's a really good one to seek out. As we get towards World War II, 1940, there's almost no, except for Dr. Cyclops, there's no real science fiction films out there. So here's the beginning of the atomic age. And it's something like Hollywood did not really grasp onto at first. 7 Days to Noon is where it really begins. This is a British film from 1950, directed and produced by the terrific Bolting brothers. And it envisions what would happen if a pacifist scientist who's working on an atomic bomb for the British government loses his mind.
Wellington has stolen a UR-12 bomb from the magazine at Wallingford.
What?
He's also written a personal letter to the Prime Minister. He says that unless it's publicly announced that Great Britain will stop making any more such weapons, he'll set it off and destroy what he calls the seat of government.
But a UR-12 would wipe out half London.
Exactly. If the Prime Minister doesn't make this announcement, your professor says that he'll explode the bomb at noon on Sunday next. Today's Monday.
The film then becomes an engrossing, exciting police procedural where they're looking for Bullington in London, who has the bomb, and they're deciding, when do we tell the public that there's this atomic bomb ready to go off in our city? It's a very hard film to find. It doesn't get that much of a release, but if you ever find it, if it ever shows up on television, see it. This, along with Howard Hawks' production of The Thing made at RKO Studios in 1951, is the real start of the science fiction cycle in Hollywood. Originally, 20th Century Fox was thinking of casting either Spencer Tracy or Claude Rains as the visitor from another planet. Cooler heads prevailed, and they thought, well, if a familiar face like Tracy or Rains came out of this flying saucer, it wouldn't feel so alien. So they needed an actor audiences weren't really too familiar with. So in walks Michael Rennie.
But he's a robot. Without you, what could he do?
There's no limit to what he could do. He could destroy the Earth.
The story of The Day the Earth Stood Still parallels the story of Christ. There's somebody who comes from the sky, and they take on the name of Carpenter, preaching peace, but they are shot by soldiers and then resurrected. The next year, the 1933 King Kong is re-released, and it makes a tremendous amount of money, so they figure, more giant monsters. Warner Brothers acquires an independently made film, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and makes a mint off of it. The film follows a dinosaur that's awakened in an atomic bomb blast up in the Arctic and then comes down the Hudson River and invades New York. Terrific stop motion animation by Ray Harryhausen. Beast from 20,000 Fathoms is making a tremendous amount of money for Warner Brothers. What's very funny was that the film's directed by Eugene Laurie, an ex-art director who worked with Chaplin. And at the premiere of his film, he brings his family, which includes a young daughter under the age of 10. And she is so saddened that her daddy made the dinosaur die at the end. So she was mad at her father. So 8 years later, 1961, Eugene Laurie makes Gorgo, where the dinosaur lives. So I hope she appreciated this whole film made for her. Bugs creep us out. Like, I'm only kidding. Anyway, whoever it was at Warner Brothers had the brilliant idea to make a movie about giant ants. So here comes Them. Probably one of the best films from this 1950s sci-fi cycle. Started the film off as a mystery. What's causing all this damage and destruction and murder in the desert? We get these little teasers. So finally we see the culprit is giant ants. Radioactive ants that have mutated since the atomic bomb test there in 1945. The film was supposed to have been shot in color, but budget cuts caused the film to be filmed in black and white, which is really a plus because it gives it like a documentary look to it. The giant ant effects are not CGI, they're not superimpositions, they're all mechanical effects. There was no optical work really done on this film. And there's great performances by James Arness and James Whitmore and Edmund Gwynne. We all know the story of War of the Worlds, written by H.G. Wells in the late 19th century, about an invasion by technically superior Martians onto the planet Earth. Well, Paramount had the rights to this story in the 1920s, and they wanted Cecil B. DeMille to make a version of it as a silent film around 1925, 1926. Well, that never really materialized. So then in the early sound era, Paramount invited the great Russian film director Sergei Eisenstein to work in Hollywood for Paramount, and one of the projects they had lined up for him was The War of the Worlds. Several years later, Orson Welles gains a lot of notoriety and fame for his War of the Worlds broadcast on radio, and Hollywood invites him over, and that's one of the properties they're thinking about for Welles. So instead he did something called Citizen Kane. So it's the early 1950s, and Paramount resurfaces War of the Worlds again. And this time they make the film. War of the Worlds really excels with Technicolor. Directed by Byron Haskin and produced by George Pal, two people who started in the film industry with special effects, visual effects. War of the Worlds is absolutely non-stop. It's interesting to note that in the 1950s, the American public really looked up to the military and to authority figures as like father figures. So then when we're watching the military might fail, it becomes all that more a terrifying film.
Guns, tanks, bombs, they're like toys against them.
Lee Marvin was supposed to play the scientist, but the role went to Gene Barry.
Got to beat them.
I'm also a big fan of the 2005 War of the Worlds, directed by Steven Spielberg, and I figure that the two films are actually companion pieces for one another. Now look at these Death Swan machines from Mars. An absolute marvel of Hollywood craftsmanship. The War of the Worlds was planned for 3D. So you have a lot of things being shot at the camera, like here. So with the success of Them, I'm sure executives all over Hollywood are taking out children's books on insects and saying, okay, we can do a giant praying mantis, giant locusts, giant spiders, which leads to one of the better giant insect movies, Tarantula. It's a lot of fun. It's about this scientifically engineered tarantula that keeps on growing larger and larger and is creating all this havoc. And this one's seeing the authorities, accompanied by scientist John Agar. They find these pools of like white icky goo that they don't know what it is. When the audience watched John Agar come up to the mysterious white goo and take a taste of it, they all went, ew! Now, two things about the ending of Tarantula. Can you guess who this fighter pilot is? Take a guess. It's Clint Eastwood. Just to show how Tarantula is a mirror of the 1950s, watch when everybody's watching the tarantula advance towards the town and it looks like there's no hope. And all of a sudden, fighter planes come up. American fighter planes come up, and everybody cheers. Now we come to the most famous giant monster of the 1950s, Godzilla. Created at Toho Studios, which is like the MGM of Japan. So they thought of a movie about a giant monster. Now, Japan, of course, was the recipient of 2 atomic attacks. Now, Godzilla is the embodiment of the atomic bomb. I managed to speak to the actor who was in the Godzilla suit, a gentleman named Haru Nakajima, and he said they thought that Godzilla was just going to be a one-shot deal, that they were going to just do this monster film, then they go back to doing at Toho war films and comedies. But Godzilla just proved to be a tremendous success, and it just started the whole franchise. When Godzilla was brought to America, actor Raymond Burr was edited into the film as an American reporter watching the carnage Godzilla brings about on Tokyo. Now, this trailer is a hoot. Listen to the narrator. He just sounds like he's over-caffeinated. And how many times does he say, King of the Monsters?
Godzilla, King of the Monsters, whose death ray blasts the city from the face of the earth before your very eyes. Godzilla, alive, stalking across the world, crushing all before it. Is Godzilla a fantasy or a prophecy of doom? For the answer, see Godzilla, King of the Monsters. A tale of horror more fantastic than any ever written by Jules Verne. Godzilla, King of the Monsters. Incredible titan of terror. A story to stun the mind as the gargantuan creature of the sea surges up on a tidal wave of destruction to wreak vengeance on the earth. Godzilla, King of the Monsters. Fantastic beyond comprehension. Tripping beyond compare. Astounding beyond belief. The mightiest monster of them all. Godzilla, King of the Monsters.
So Godzilla's king of who again? The big studios are making their science fiction films, as are the smaller studios, on smaller budgets. So you have the more exploitive Catwomen of the Moon, with Sonny Tufts and Marie Windsor, and Gone with the Wind's Victor Jory in there somewhere. And then you have Roger Corman, who just was a master at putting together films in like 4 or 5 days and having them actually work. They're actually not bad. So you look at his Attack of the Crab Monsters, made in 1957 with Russell Johnson. You know him as the professor in Gilligan's Island. And there you have this crab monster that's an actual practical effect. That means they actually built this large crab monster, and it's not bad, not shabby for a very small budget.
Here are monsters with razor-sharp claws that hand grenades and dynamite cannot stop.
One of the more unusual and interesting entries into 1950s science fiction is 1953's The Magnetic Monster, directed by Ivan Tors. Now, Tors did other science fiction films like Gog and Riders to the Stars, and he just loved to infuse a lot of science into his films. So, look at the trailer for Magnetic Monster. It feels like part science fiction film, part classroom science film. It's very odd and a lot of fun.
I'm now going to set the Deltatron at its maximum output and close the floodgates. I want you all to leave. You've got about 7 minutes to reach the surface. see the magnetic monster battle its deadliest enemy, the giant Deltatron. See the last desperate chance they took to check its appalling power. See it shatter the steel walls of its mammoth prison beneath the sea.
Torres would later produce the TV series Flipper, and he was just a whirlwind of filmmaking energy. Now here's Warning from Space. Probably has the most wildest looking space monsters from the 1950s, these starfish guys. They were designed by a prominent avant-garde artist in Japan named Taro Akamoto. He has 2 museums in Japan devoted to his wonderfully off-the-wall work. Now, 1962, that's the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And a couple of films came out wondering what life would be like maybe weeks or months after a nuclear war. But then you have Creation of the Humanoids, which is wondering what life would be like many, many years after a nuclear war. And Creation of the Humanoids is actually reported to be Andy Warhol's favorite film because it's so off-kilter, so weird, and so much oddball fun if you got the time. Because all they do in Creation of the Humanoids is talk.
We'd better check that out. Their effect on each other was most interesting. When we picked them up, they were kissing. That's understandable.
The director, Wesley Barry, should have realized he should have showed the robots finding the couple kissing instead of just having these guys just stand around talking about it. And it's very odd that way. It's such like a non-movie. And at the end, the robots actually stand there talking about a chase that's going on between the good guys and bad guys. Quite an odd movie-going experience. So give it a chance. In the mid-60s, the atomic scare films, the monster films, were really just winding down because audiences wanted more realistic films. There was a lot more relaxed censorship in films, so you could have films like Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate. And audiences were going for more of the realism. They didn't really care to see matted in giant insects or flying saucers all that much. A lot of people were watching these films in the 1970s on television on such venues as Creature Features and Chiller Theater. And the problem is that the TV guides at the time, here's a TV guide from the 1970s, and you can tell it's from the 1970s because here's an air conditioner for sale for $99, that the critic for the newspaper, he really, if you look at it, he gives 1 or 2 stars to most science fiction films. He kind of has a sort of snobby look at movies where he'll say about Godzilla, he'll say 1 star out of 4. Laugh along with Raymond Burr and the entire population of Tokyo. This is a terrible movie. So these movies were not getting the respect they really deserved. Now we're taking a second, third, fourth look at these films and we're saying, hey, they're really a lot of fun. They're really intelligent and they're worth watching. So, as they say in the thing, watch the skies or watch the TV screen. This is Glenn Andreiev. You have a good day and thanks for joining in.